Hey everybody, it's Eugene here, and welcome to Forensics Talks. This is episode 70, and today my guest is Mr. Tobin Tanaka, and he is going to be speaking to us about forensic document examinations. Now, what I'd like you to do in the chat window, and just make sure, I always like to check that everything's working well. If you can hear me, just say, hey, great, and let us know where you're from. I always like to know where people are watching from, what part of the world they're chiming in from. So go ahead and just put that in there. We're going to get started right away here, and let me start with a little introduction. So Mr. Tobin Tanaka has been a forensic document examiner with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service between 1993 and 2000. And in 2000, he commenced working as a forensic document examiner for the Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, which was transferred to his current employment at the Canada Border Services Agency in December 2003. He's been a part-time instructor at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, where he teaches a question document examination course for forensic science students. He has several professional memberships and part of different organizations, like the document section of the Canadian Society of Forensic Science, member of the question document section of the American Academy of Forensic Science, and he's a regular member of the American Society of Question Document Examiners, where he was also the editor from 2014 and to 2018. Now, he's currently on the roster of Justice Rapid Response, which is a global entity that provides specialized justice experts to assist with international investigations. And I should mention before we begin that although Mr. Tanaka works for the Canada Border Services Agency, he's here on his own. He's not representing the Canadian Border Services or government in any way. So based on that, I'm going to bring him in here. There he is. Hey, Tobin, how are you?
Hello, Eugene. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. Thanks.
Well, all right. Well, yeah, I did a little disclaimer for you, so I hope that was okay.
It was good. Right. Very good. Thanks.
All right. And I should say also, you were here on a little bit of short notice because originally I had scheduled for Sammy Abraham, who you know very well. And she got called away on an assignment, an important assignment. And so, yeah, you've really stepped up here, so I appreciate that. Okay, well, let me begin with how you got started in this particular area. I'm interested to know. I mean, 1993 is going back. So, were you headed in the forensic document thing, or did you fall into it? How did that happen?
I kind of fell into it. So, what happened essentially was back in my days in university, there was the potential that I could have a summer job with mechanical engineering department that had posted a summer position for working in collision reconstruction. So it wasn't that we would do collision reconstruction, but it was a research grant that the university had to hire summer students to do different work with them in this sort of area. So I found this kind of interesting that, back then there were not the forensic programs that exist in the Canadian context as there is now. So back then, I applied for that position. I did not get that position, but it kind of made me interested in it. So I sort of, if you will, as you say, kind of fell into this position or getting into document examination because what happened was I sent my resume and CV off to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and months later, I got contacted by who was to be my trainer, and he trained me in document examination, not exclusively, but with him and others. That's how I ended up in the profession. So it was not by design. I didn't know that there was such a thing as document examiners earlier, but I did not know exactly how to get into it, nor was I looking necessarily to enter this field.
Okay. Hey, what happened with the transition? So, for example, when it was first the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and then it was the sorry. What I mean is Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, and then it became Canada Border Services. Was it just a rename, or what happened there?
There was an administrative change, and that's what led to the department being split into two entities, so to speak. So there's back when it was Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, or CCRA, it was split into Canada Revenue Agency and also Canada Border Services Agency. So there was an administrative split in the department.
Okay. But I mean, originally, the fact that you're doing document examination with a revenue agency means to me that there's probably revenue and finance was a big part of the whole forensic document examination.
That's right. That's correct. Yes,
Yeah.
and that still is a lot of work done now. Exactly.
Yeah. So let me ask you early on, when you got started, in terms of the kind of training that was out there and the kind of things that were available to people in this particular field, was it like a lot of courses, a lot of training? Like, was it very well known back then?
Well, the training for document examiners, at least in the North American context, has been reasonably well established as to what topics should be covered since at least the later 80s, at least. So when I entered the field, there was sort of a push a little bit to sort of standardize a little bit more of the types of topics that would be covered. So what has been recognized for some time is that to be trained as a document examiner, you really need to have the on-the-job apprentice style training with a primary trainer. So it's not something that can be done exclusively by taking correspondence courses, for example. So there is really a key component to having both the practical and the theoretical aspects of the training. So the theory reinforces the practical side, and the practical doing casework with a mentor reinforces the theoretical side. So that's been well recognized for many years as far as that goes.
Okay.
What has happened is that more standardization of certain training topics, as well as what should be covered, has certainly increased over the years.
Okay. If you had to define forensic document examination in, if you when you define it to students or to the layperson, whatever, what's the best definition that you provide?
I think the best definition that is the short answer to it is essentially it's the forensic examination of any document, and I'll define a document in a bit more in a moment, but any document or materials that might be used in whole or in part to create a document to answer questions such as who created the document, how was it created, when it was created, and that type of source or other questions that pertain to that document. That's really the key thing. Now, a document in a broad sense can be almost anything that can be used to convey information. So while most document examiners are looking at exclusively paper documents, it could be extended to other more unusual type circumstances such as graffiti or writing on walls or writing on other unusual types of surfaces.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So, somebody writes something on the wall at a crime scene or something, or whatever. Then you're sending a message on the document happens to be a wall, right?
That's right. It could be that, or it could be an unusual type of circumstance. I mean, there can be writing on other things, such as writing on glass, for example. So examples of that can actually happen. And there's not necessarily a crime scene so much. It could be a situation where it would be part of something that would happen. So I'm thinking of other colleagues who said they might have dealt with, for example, writings that are on cars, say in a used car lot, right? So they're
Right, right.
writing entries onto the car with some type of pen. And that's not necessarily something that by itself would be a crime scene. It's just that what happened is it could be some kind of, for example, an issue of who wrote something because of some other question that comes up.
Okay. I was just thinking, so I know that there's been a lot of development in this area, like the past 100 years, like a lot of growth and stuff like that. But I'm just curious about historic, like ancient stuff, like is forgeries like from 500 years ago or like 1,000 years ago. Is there any like ancient or historical things where people try to look at in that regard?
It does come up occasionally, these types of things. So the most classic one, if people want to look into this more, is what happened with Mark Hoffman. And so Mark Hoffman in the 1980s, he lived in the Salt Lake City area in Utah, and he was someone who dealt a lot with rare documents. And what happened essentially was he was creating by various means, ancient documents that were trying to rewrite parts of history that relate to the Mormon Church and the founding of the Mormon Church. So what happened was that he was trying to sell these documents for large amounts of money. And what happened over a period of time was he created more and more of these documents. And at one point, there was this incendiary device that was in his car. And it was determined by various investigative means that he was trying to send around, he was trying to kill certain people who kind of clued in that he was trying to do this. So the document examination did not solve those murders directly, but what happened was it was shown that he was essentially, if you will, like almost like a master forger. So he was trying to fabricate documents from the 19th century, and he was quite successful at doing this because he would, by various means, really try to replicate the materials and other types of aspects of document creation of that time period. So he actually went to get older styles of papers by a variety of means, and he was quite successful in creating a lot of these types of documents.
Okay. I was
But he
reading
was
that.
detected.
Oh, okay. I was reading that before, like this sort of this discipline was formed. It was like, for example, people that worked in banks that would be doing this sort of thing because, forged money or forged documents or deeds or like things like that. So before there was a discipline, that it was the bankers that were doing. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yeah, exactly. So what happened historically was courts and lawyers would rely upon bankers or those who taught at the time penmanship and that type of thing in schools when it was a lot more focus. And so what happened from this is that they were calling upon them to do these kinds of examinations, especially for handwriting and for signatures. That's what happened historically.
Okay. And then who would you say, or when was the moment, or who was the person that really first started to begin this whole area? Like, was there somebody write a book first? Did somebody say, "Hey, we're going to make something called FDE," or how did it happen?
Yeah. So the founder, if you will, of document examination, or what he called it as question documents, was Albert S. Osborne. And his first book in 1910 that is specifically called Question Documents. He was sort of the founder, if you will, of document examination insofar as he wrote the first sort of, if you will, groundbreaking text that summarized what the work of a document examiner is and how it might answer different questions about disputed documents.
Okay. And what about organization-wise? What was the first known, let's say, organization in this area?
Okay, he was also the founder of what is now the American Society of Question Document Examiners.
Oh, okay, okay.
So Albert S. Osborne was the founder of that, and that organization was formally established in 1942, but he had informal meetings prior to that between, I'm just going from memory here, at least from the 1920s up until the formal founding of the organization. So he literally would have other document examiners come over to his house for a period of a few days, and they would talk about different document examination problems. So the term question documents and the term forensic document examination are synonymous with each other in the sense that they could be, you hear both terms being used, but they really refer to the same thing.
Okay. In terms of technology, I'm thinking about the tools that are at your disposal and how those have changed over time. So, for example, when you started in 1993 in the 90s, what kinds of things were at your disposal then, like tools? And I'm curious to know how that's changed, like over the years and up to today, and the kinds of tools that you're using now.
Certainly, there's been a lot of miniaturization of certain types of instrumentation. So, and improvements in terms of even the stereo microscope, which is a common commonly used instrument by document examiners everywhere. There's been several improvements in that in terms of both magnification. Illumination is especially an area where there's been significant improvements, and, if you will, flexibility. So even with illumination, the simple fact that LED lights now are very commonly used for a lot of things, even having that has significantly miniaturized certain types of instrumentation like that. And it's made it more adaptable for certain things, because you can now take much of this instrumentation into the field, where if you need to do an examination outside of the laboratory, that is much easier to do now than it was previously.
Okay, interesting. What about technologies like today, looking at artificial intelligence and stuff like that? There's a lot of talk about this. Has artificial intelligence been applied already to question document examinations?
It has to differing degrees. Sometimes a lot of this type of work was being done by different institutions who were trying to automate certain kinds of problems. So some of the researchers working in this area might have had a different focus initially. They weren't so concerned about identification of particular writers, for example. But in some of the processes was used to try to do essentially handwriting recognition for automation. So these examples include things such as what the postal services were trying to accomplish, whereby an envelope is addressed and then it's put into the mail system. And the postal system is not so concerned about about who wrote that, but they're trying to, if you will, remove the individuality of the handwriting to make it basically a file that is understood by a computer for example, for machine sorting of postal mail, or for banks who have handwritten checks or handwritten forms where they're trying to capture the information for automatic processing. So the focus on that side for handwriting recognition was to, if you will, remove the individuality of handwriting, but get the content of what the document says in handwriting, so that it could be used for other things. Whereas in the document examination side, of course, we care less about what something says, but are more concerned about comparing, words or signatures or things of a comparable nature. So for example, if, let's take a financial example, if some kind of entry says $300, we care less about what that says. We want to compare $300 or dollars against other comparable words or letter combinations. So that's a bit of a difference. So there has been AI applied now more on the forensic side. And for those who might be interested, there's other systems that have really pushed the envelope on this a little bit. The FBI in the US, in consultation with Gannon Technologies, if I remember correctly, has made a system called Flash ID, which is a system that is supposed to be able to compare handwritings across a variety of different languages especially. So there's lots of applications where AI is maybe starting to increase into this more.
In terms of the move and the shift that society has had going from paper to digital, I mean, I know people still, like, for example, in the courts, they still use paper all the time, right? I'm sure that banks and things like that still have to have paper records. So has the forensic document examination crossed over a little bit to the electronic side, the digital side?
Yes, so this is to be expected, in the sense that if we take a simple example of a contract between different parties, it might be that a contract is printed, someone may sign that document and then scan it and send it to someone else, and then they may print it and then they may sign that document, and then they may again scan it and send it to someone else again, or back to the originating party. So this type of thing is going on. And so sometimes certain kinds of situations may involve someone to look at the digital sort of file and the document examiner to look at the paper file in combination with someone who works in digital evidence. So there will be more of this happening in the future for sure.
Okay. And what about like things like because now people will you're asked to sign your name, like you go to the store, right, and you pay for something and you got to sign your name with that electronic pen and it never comes out the same. Or for example, you try to sign your name with a computer mouse, or people can easily alter stuff digitally as well. Like, is all that stuff that plays into the field of FDE?
It is to differing degrees, yes, for sure. And I mean, sometimes if you have to sign something with a mouse, that tends to be a very unnatural kind of. Usually don't use a mouse as a writing instrument. You're usually using it for computer interaction. And interestingly enough, on that side, what might be called digitally captured signatures, and there's different kinds, can have a lot of potential for comparisons. So in the North American context, it seems to be more common that if you sign on a digitizing pad, that pad is only capturing a very low resolution picture, if you will, of your signature. And it can be within a very unusual writing instrument, like a stylus that feels a bit strange. The surface is not your usual surface, or a mouse, or your finger signing on the screen. On the other hand, there are actually digitizing tablets that can record the actual physical act of writing, the dynamic data, which is in effect almost like replaying a movie, if you want to call it that, of how your signature was produced. So it will literally, if it's done in a certain way, it can actually show the actual act of writing itself and how long it took someone to write a signature. So on a very good systems, and this is more common in Europe, it seems, there's a whole protocol that European colleagues have published on digitally captured signatures, and they have gone through, they actually have a whole procedure that discusses how this can be done. And it actually, that kind of hybrid type thing actually provides a lot of benefit, because you actually have the complexity of the physical signature itself, which is actually very difficult to actually mimic. And you have the digital data that shows literally how it was written. So someone who's attempting to simulate or forge a signature would have many more the barriers to overcome.
Yeah, I can see how somebody could try that. Or I could see how somebody could try to use, we were talking about AI, to copy something as well, or try to make it look more natural, or, use it for malicious purposes. You had mentioned Europe, and I was curious about different places in the world where forensic document examination might be even more important than in North America. And I was just wondering, are there places where in the world where like this is it's a big deal, it's a big area, there's maybe like larger groups of people working in this area?
Well, in Europe, one difference in continental Europe is that there tends to be, although it's differing now, it's changing a little bit, that at one time there was one group of document examiners who were trained in handwriting and signatures exclusively, and others who dealt with all the other kinds of document issues. That is changing a little bit. There is more of this, if you want to call it a holistic approach, where the document examiner is trained for both sort of areas, the handwriting side and the non-handwriting side. But there is a bit of variation in that. So there is certainly growth, if you will. There is growth in certain areas. So there is, in some places in the world, there's certainly growth in the demand for document examination. And even within North America, even though some public institutions have decreased their presence or the number of people trained in document examination, if anything, there's actually greater demand for it now than there probably ever was, because in one way, documents are easier to create now than they ever were. You can create more documents and faster than there ever was before. In addition to that, there's just worldwide trade. Simply put, much more trade is happening worldwide now than there ever was. And so there's actually greater need for document examination often.
I was just thinking, like, when people are trying to forge something aside, and well, I had another thought too, because I know that kids, when they get a bad mark at school back in the day, they were trying to, switch the F to a different letter or something like that. But these days, if it's drug related crime, or if it's money laundering or whatever it is, that's often international, right? Like people are trying to put money elsewhere. They're trying to make the paper trail very difficult. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about, is there like an international organization, or for example, Interpol? Like, does Interpol work with examiners, document examiners worldwide, to try and locate these people and try to figure some of these things out?
Yeah. There's not a formal, if you will, like roster of the cooperation. A lot of this is just interpersonal, just relationships. People know each other, or they know each other just from professional conferences and so on, to how they know each other. So there's not so much formal, if you will, groups like this. I mean, there are the professional types of associations, be that the ASQD, as I mentioned, the American Society of Question Document Examiners, or uh, other organizations such as the European Network of Forensic Handwriting Experts, or European Document Expert Working Group, or in Australia, the Australian New Zealand Forensic Science Society, or other places such as the Asian Forensic Sciences Network. So there are different professional organizations where professionals and or their institutes where they work at are coming together to address different issues. So that's often what's happening, as far as that goes.
Okay. And in North America, let's say for the most part, what has the trend been over the years in terms of document examination? Is it a growing field, or have we lost people? What is your take on that right now?
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've lost many of the people from retirements, and in some of the public institutions, there has been a loss of inertia, if you will, in terms of keeping as many document examiners, in my view, as there probably should be, because certain types of fraud have certainly not gone away, and I think that this is quite important. And many of them are still going to be paper based because, as they say to other colleagues, quite often for very high value transactions, be it real estate or commercial leases or things of that nature, those things more often than not are going to still be paper based because they deal with contractual obligations over a long period of time. And especially if they're international in nature, the reality is that oftentimes just to reinforce contracts by paper basis is still often going to be the case. So I think, unfortunately, I think the short answer is that, in my view, we haven't kept up in the North American context in terms of getting new document examiners into the field as much as we should have. I mean, there are people in training now, but we could certainly use many more.
Yeah. Well, I said at the beginning that you teach at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, and so is the question document examination course that you teach?
That's right. Although that course does not train people to become document examiners. So that course is more of an introduction course that is meant to provide the forensic science students with the knowledge that, okay, this is what document examination is. We cover different topics, but it is a very limited introduction, but it's to make them aware of what document examination is. And in particular, I really try to stress to everyone that sometimes people view document examination solely as handwriting examiners. And that's much of our work, but it's not the sum total of our work. So there are many other things that we will address in the course of doing our work. And most examinations require more than handwriting or signature examination. There is often another component of something that's needed to answer questions.
Yeah, it's rather interesting because if I think about different forensic science universities and such, I would say that there's probably not a lot of exposure to question documents for the students, and in some cases, maybe none. They might have heard about it or something like that, but they don't get maybe not even a lecture on it, right? So Is this kind of unique for this course to be given? Like, is it given at other places as well?
I'm not aware of it being, at least in Canada, I'm not aware of it being given at any other Canadian university. Like I said, this, of course, it's a different focus. We try to introduce to the students just what areas does document examination cover, and what types of things do we do, also what types of things we do not do. So one thing I didn't say just a moment ago is, one thing I should stress is that document examiners do not practice graphology, which is the belief that one can determine personality from handwriting. So we do not do that. We compare handwritings most often to determine if two or more entries of writing are from a common source. That's a very common question, but it's not the only one that could be addressed.
So help me with that a little bit. So graphology is more about interpreting the underlying message, or like the psychology of the person writing the message.
That's right. Personality traits. I don't know about psychology, but it's more about, are there the actual belief with graphology is that one can determine personality traits from handwriting, which is not what we do.
Okay, okay.
So that's
Let
not
me
what we
ask
do.
you. Let me ask you a question about cases, because I'm curious about some of the more notable cases that have been around in history, and I'll ask you about one to start with. But there was I think it was called the Panama Papers one in Pakistan. Can you tell me a little bit about that one?
Okay, sure. I can get just some basics with it. So there was a time period going back where the former president of Pakistan was under investigation for corruption, and papers surfaced that dealt with some flats in London, in the UK. And the issue about that was whether or not these papers, which purportedly claimed that certain flats in London were, if I recall correctly, under trust ownership with his daughter. I don't remember the exact relationship, but the papers had to do with these flats in London. And what happened with this was that when these were looked at further, it was found that the font used, Calibri, was not commercially released at that time period when the documents were made. And there are other examples of this kind of thing where certain other technologies or materials or other things that pertain to a document's creation are not plausible given when certain technologies or things became available.
Interesting. See, I wouldn't have even thought about that, but I guess that's when they go back and kick themselves in the butt and said, I should have used the Times New Roman or whatever, different font or something like that.
Something that was available, something that would have been
Yeah,
available.
interesting. What about there was a big one in Brazil, right? There was the one they call Lava Jato, which is the car wash, I guess Operation Car Wash, where there was like bribes, billions of bribes. So were there attempts there like to hide where the money was coming from, or what was going on in that case?
Yeah, I don't know of any document examinations done directly in that. So there may have been, I don't know, but these are examples of these larger files of what might be called grand corruption. These are instances when quite often different types of documents might arise suddenly to explain certain things that may have happened. There are different examples of this kind of thing where oftentimes someone needs to create a document to sort of explain something. And sometimes that could be plausible or it could explain something and it may be legitimate. But for an investigator, if they're trying to answer the question, this is where a document examination may be able to answer the questions. I say may be able to because there are some things that document examination cannot answer, or we may not be able to answer it. But it's at least an avenue of forensic science that may answer some questions for them.
Well, I mean, you've had a super long, I mean, your career spans over multiple decades, so you must have seen some really good cases. Are there any that stick out in your head as like, wow, there was like some really interesting technical stuff that happened on this one, or just anything that was notable that you can talk about?
Yeah, there's several. Well, there's different cases that have come up over a time period, like some things are interesting because of sometimes it's the most minor thing that really makes you think about, okay, this is quite interesting, that this is what happened. Sometimes what happens too is you get cases that pertain to documents that are a little bit older. So one thing we always stress to people too is that document examination is not just about documents from today or even a few years ago. Oftentimes documents will arise many years later or decades later, and then they become disputed or they become an important piece of evidence in particular cases. So in the case that, one case that I can address is the case involving Hissène Habré. He was a former president of Chad. So the Extraordinary African Chambers was established to try the person or persons most responsible for certain crimes committed in Chad in the early 80s. So different documents came up that bore handwriting that was in question, and it was requested that I examine certain handwritings and have them compared against the handwritings of Hissène Habré to determine whether or not he wrote certain entries.
Okay.
So that was and these documents were from the 80s, and I examined these in about 2000, between 2014 and 15. Actually, sorry, 2013 to 15.
I'm going to come back to cases, but we have a question here from Paolo, if I can find it here. But he was asking about, we were talking about like organizations, and then we were talking about the training that you do or the course that you run as well. But he's asking about certification. So like, is there a place that people go to get trained on this? Is there, where do you get this kind of certification from?
Right. Well, yeah, this is quite difficult. So one thing I should specify is I see there's a reference to ISO 17025. So one thing I should define too is there's certification and then there's accreditation. So certification usually in a certain context refers to the individual practitioner, whereas accreditation usually refers to the entity that one is in or the laboratory that one is in. So for example, ISO 17025 addresses accreditation of a laboratory, and it usually refers to a quality procedures for that laboratory. But it does not specifically address the training that individuals would have, where certification addresses the minimum standards for training and basic, if you will, competency and ongoing professional training that an examiner is required to undergo. So as an example, the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners provides certification for examiners who are resident in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Unfortunately, that's not available wider, but there are other types of certification types of programs that might be available in other locales.
Okay. Let me go back to cases. I was wondering, it's very common for people to, for example, somebody were to write you a check, and that check is for, 2,000, and then, they try to squeeze in another zero, and all of a sudden it becomes 20,000. So do you see these types of things like less now, or were they much more common in the past?
Oh, like if you're talking about alterations to documents,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they can happen for different reasons. And one thing is exactly, I mean, certain things may shift in how they get done. So certain types of checks are probably not produced as much as they once were, but other forms of payment or things like promissory notes, those still come up once in a while. So certainly people may try to change those by different means. It can also happen with things like different kinds of handwritten logbooks, for example. So that type of thing, someone might, as you say, try to change or alter an entry in a logbook or something for some particular reason. And that happened historically, but it could still happen today. Sometimes that type of thing could still happen where someone tries to change an entry in a logbook. And sometimes because of what it is, if it's a multi-page contract, those are always other examples. Rather than trying to change it by handwriting over top of it, someone might just try to reprint the page. and then put another different page in the contract, for example.
Right. Let me ask you another question regarding the sort of the relationship between, where you are in with the border services and, for example, the police. Like, are the police aware of forensic document examination or the need for it? Like, what's sort of the relationship, and how aware are the police, like, that maybe they need somebody like this?
Yeah, in my view, the police are often not aware of it as they probably could be, and this may have to do with the types of investigations that they may have been involved with. It may also have to do with their training time. It may be that they don't get the exposure to it because they have a lot of topics to cover in training, understandably. So they may not have the opportunity to get even the basic exposure to it. But it may also depend upon the types of investigations that they are involved with. It may be something that comes up rarely, but sometimes it may address certain questions that they wouldn't have thought possible to be addressed by document examination.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you about there was I guess there was an investigation and a report in Canada recently in BC, and I think was it called the Cullen Commission, that put out a report. And I wanted, if you can, just maybe touch on just briefly the report and the significance to you.
Yeah, so the Cullen Commission came out not that long ago, and it was really a report that summarized. It was a commission of inquiry into the money laundering in BC, and specifically there was different things that had to be addressed. The report itself is somewhere in the range of 1,800 pages, I think, and I have not read the entire report. I read a good portion of it, but not the entire report yet. And in it, the commissioner he spoke about trying that. There's actually several recommendations he made into this, and one thing that he was really trying to address was that how there was a lack of mechanisms to conduct different kinds of financial both investigations and basic compliance measures. So sometimes to counter things like money laundering, people often say you have to have measures in place that try to reduce it in the first place. So with this kind of thing in mind, I mean, you don't have document examination mentioned directly, but this is an area, I think document examination, personally, it's my view that document examination may be able to address certain questions that might come up in different questions about money laundering, either the money laundering that may have suspected to have happened after the fact, or even in compliance measures before certain things happen. Document examination might be able to assist in addressing certain questions.
So do you ever get inquiries from local police agencies or smaller agencies that come to you and say, hey, we need some help?
It does come up, and actually we get all sorts of different questions come up. People will ask, or they may find out about us, and we would get queries from different entities to ask about, we have something that we think might need a document examiner's type of assistance with.
Okay. There's a question here, and I don't know, I'll take a chance here, and because I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I'll bring it up. It's from Janny Vester. So he's asking if you can expand on ASB ANSI standards applicable to the field of FDE.
Oh, yeah, I probably could expand on that a little bit. Exactly. Yeah, certainly. So there are different standards. So the Academy Standards Board, which was established by the American Academy of Forensic Science, was trying to, if you will, write standards that could be applicable for different kinds of examinations, as well as to address things such as conclusions used by document examiners, the minimum standards for training and document examiners, and the ANSI. Yeah, so there are different things on that are actually quite important. The ASB has not been around as long as the Scientific Working Group on Document Examination, or SWGDOC, SWGDOC. Hasn't been around as long as that, but it is well on its way to making more standards that, again, that are publicly available, that will make the process of examination perhaps a bit more transparent and explain some things that, again, are useful because the examination process using standards like that is good because it does bring some degree of uniformity to the kinds, how an examination would be approached, yet allowing for some flexibility because not every case that comes in is the same.
Mm-hmm. There's obviously an international aspect to this. Is there an international conference, or does what's sort of the big global conference for forensic document examiners?
I don't know if there's really one meeting. I wouldn't say that there's any one meeting that is like the international one. Certainly, the annual meeting of the ASQDE is good. It does attract examiners from US, Canada, Europe, some from Australia, and occasionally others from other places in the world. But again, it does tend to be very North American centric. The European meeting, specifically the European Network of Forensic Handwriting Experts and the European Document Expert Working Group, under the auspices of the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, which is a larger sort of forensic science body, is good. It actually brings together a lot of the different areas like that, as well as the Australian meeting. So I don't know if there's any one meeting that is specifically like the international meeting, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that like in countries like is Nigeria, Ghana, I think are they dealing a lot more with this type of document examination and alterations and a lot more issues surrounding money laundering and that sort of thing?
Yes, certainly, and also anti-corruption measures as well, which we also have within Canada and the US as well. So one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that, large-scale corruption types of investigations often will involve document examination. Oftentimes, it will be just the scale of alleged fraud that needs to be investigated. So oftentimes, this is the kind of thing needs to have document examination involved in order to answer certain questions. And I think in Nigeria, colleagues that I've met previously have talked about this, and they've said that they have worked extensively to try and address these things. And in some places, such as in Nigeria, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission has done different work in very difficult circumstances to try to address corruption issues. Mm-hmm. Sometimes with other assistance as well. And that other assistance, for example, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, in partnership, as my understanding, with the Nigerian authorities, was important in establishing the EFCC in the first place.
If you have to testify at trial, I'm just curious what kinds of things that maybe you might get hit with by a defense expert or something like that. Like, what kinds of things are they asking you about, or do you see any common questions that they ask you?
I think the common question quite often for handwriting and with signature examination is that there will be questions about how objective the process actually is of doing handwriting comparisons. And this was a criticism that was raised some 30 odd years ago by certain critics. And what happened after that was there was a fair bit of research done into testing the abilities of professional document examiners as compared to laypersons. And it was found that, generally speaking, overall, that document examiners are far more proficient at comparing handwriting and signatures as compared to laypersons. And in particular, to cite a couple of the studies, what tends to happen is that laypersons will tend to over-associate handwritings. That is to say, when two pieces of writing are not from a common source, that the layperson will more commonly make the error of over-association.
Interesting. Yeah, bias is a big deal now, right? So there's a lot of people publishing papers on, in different areas like pathology and fingerprints and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I was just curious about that as well. This is Leopold Luke. He's asking about Caribbean, Trinidad, Jamaica. Are there any document examiners there?
Yes, there are. Actually, in Trinidad, I haven't seen anyone from Trinidad recently at a conference, but certainly there's activity in Trinidad for sure, Jamaica as well. I know that there's document examination that's been established there. I don't know anyone personally from who's working currently in those locations. I know one colleague who was from the Trinidad and Tobago back in the 80s, Dr. Linton Mohammed. He is now in the US, but I don't know anyone else personally right now who's within the Caribbean, but certainly there was demand in those different places, as there is everywhere else, actually. There's lots of demand for document examination in all different parts of the world. It seems like it's something universal. So
Let me ask you, I mean, you've had a very extensive career, and I know you're probably doing all kinds of things, but what is your, like, your next thing? Like, what is Tobin Tanaka working on now that he's pushing it in the area of forensic document examination?
well, one thing that some of us were looking at before, there's different topics, just as you said, there's almost so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I'm a bit more interested in more recently is just the influence of other languages on, for example, English. So if you just look at, if someone knows a different script of writing, whatever that would be, a non-Latin based language, for example, how does that influence the writing in a Latin-based language? And we've known about these kinds of influences for many years, but the specifics of some of that would be quite interesting. Another one as well is just the area of how certain types of technology could be used for nefarious purposes, so to speak. So, for example, 3D printing, it might be commonly, in your audience, people have been concerned about the use of 3D printers to make things such as firearms. Well, that type of technology in a potentially negative way could also be used, for example, to make rubber stamps, for example, that might be used for official documents or even non-official documents. So that's another. There's no shortage of potential avenues to explore, but those are two examples that come to my mind offhand.
Okay.
I'm sure there's many others that just escape me for the moment.
I don't know if you were setting me up there, but actually last week our topic was 3D printed firearms. So I don't know if that's if you had seen that or not, but yeah. Well, it's always, and it's good for, there's some people from academia or people that want to pursue this. I think it's just important for them to know, like, what are the next things that maybe they could work on. In terms of texts or literature out there, what would you recommend as some of the best references in the area of forensic document examination?
Yeah, I think, well, there's certainly a few different types of books. I mean, the classic book written by Osborne, although dated from 1910 and the later edition from 1929, Question Documents, is a good introduction to sort of the general thinking of how the field got started. Another classic book, but later was written by Wilson Harrison, entitled Suspect Documents. That was written around 1958 or so. And those books, I mean, some of them are dated a bit more, but some of them really give certain kinds of descriptions of basic document problems that are quite useful to read about. And later on, the book by Ordway Hilton, Scientific Examination of Question Documents, and a later edition of that edited by Jan Seaman Kelly and Brian Lindblom. That book was reissued in 2006. And there are other ones, the Huber and Hedrick's Handwriting Identification. There's two different editions of that book out that are certainly worth looking at because that book focuses exclusively on handwriting and with signatures, quite extensive on that. And then more recently, there was the scientific, more recently there's the other publication that I contributed to, which was the Scientific Examination of Documents in the 21st Century. And I make that mention because there's a lot of other colleagues involved with that too, but we contributed to that, and it covered some of the other areas that may not have been covered in some of the previous books. And there are many others, actually. There's other books and publications, and certainly any of the journals now that have question document research in them is quite good as well. And one note on that too is that we see another thing too with globalization, certainly in document examination. There are many more papers coming out from all over the world now that are being published in all the scientific literature, which is very good. So certainly from Asia, there's many more publications coming out from Asia now on document examination, and this is excellent. I think this is really building a lot of expertise worldwide, and we're seeing other research going on in other areas as well. So I think this is certainly expanding the area, and I'm hoping in the future that there'll be further development with a lot of the countries and regions in the world that might have been underserved by document examination, not because it wasn't needed, but it's maybe difficult to get it established in some places. But hopefully there'll be much more development work on that.
Tobin, if somebody wants to get a hold of you or has questions, is it okay if I just put up your LinkedIn profile? Would that be okay with you?
That's fine by me. Certainly, if people have questions about things, they could do that. I may try to address questions. I won't promise I'll answer every question, so that I'll say that right now, but I'll try to address what I can.
Yeah. And there may be some questions in the comments that maybe I didn't answer specifically, but if you go back on YouTube afterwards, you can probably look in the comments section and then answer anything that might be there. So, but look, I want to say thank you very much. This has been great, very insightful, and yeah, I hope I hope at some point in the future I can have you back, and maybe we can talk about more like specific cases and things like that. So much appreciated for your time.
Okay, thanks so much.
Hang back for a second, and then I'll come back, okay?
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, cheers. Okay, folks, well, that does it for this Forensics Talks. Over the next little while, it's going to be a little sketchy with in terms of some of the Forensics Talks episodes, but I'll make sure that I try to post a week before. There's a lot of training, a lot of stuff that's coming up, so going to keep trying to push these out as best as possible. But I want to say thanks to everyone. I saw that there was people, and we had an international representation here. So look, thank you very much, and I wish you a very good Thursday. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.